This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Thank you very much for joining me for the show today. We've received a ton of great feedback from our listeners on Apreneur.com, and I truly appreciate it. If you enjoy what you're listening to today, please share it with others so that we can continue to create a rich and vibrant community. Now, how much time did you spend wondering about the potential quality of the last medical procedure you were involved with? More specifically, did you spend a lot of time consternating about whether or not the tools being used in the procedure, either by you or the medical professionals you were with, were reliable and safe? Now, this is an intriguing question for many of us. For example, I was born in the United States, but I have lived outside the US for the last 11 years, and I spent a good deal of my time in parts of the world that did not have running water or reliable power or ironclad hygiene practices. When I consider the question of reliability and safety of medical devices, while wearing each of those three hats, I come up with very different answers. As I'm willing to bet, so would many of you. This is a question that has plagued Kate Michi Ettinger since 2010. And as our guest today for the 103rd episode of Terms of Reference, I talk with Kate about OpenQRS, an organization she founded to specifically address the issue. Kate is a social innovation consultant, a product designer, and a healthcare ethicist. She is trained in law, bioethics, and conflict resolution, and has over 15 years of health-related experience in private, government, academic, and the nonprofit sectors. The QRS in OpenQRS, as you might guess, stands for quality, reliability, and safety. As the catalyst for OpenQRS, Kate currently focuses on how to harness new technologies such as sensors and wireless and mobile to make it easy, effective, and affordable to monitor data on quality, reliability, and safety for medical devices deployed anywhere in the world. I spoke with Kate in San Francisco. Hello, Kate. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Where are you sitting today?
I am sitting in San Francisco, a perfectly foggy day. What we're most famous for.
Can I start saying I left my heart in San Francisco? That's the only thing that ever comes to mind when I hear San Francisco. But that's great. Great. It's we're having this conversation one day before April Fool's Day, so I hope that the weather's warming up. That you're not wearing too much of a sweater. But you work. I found you and wanted to have you on the show specifically to talk about an initiative you're involved with called OpenQRS, but you also have your own consultancy. Why don't you tell us about OpenQRS and the other work that you do in the development and aid space?
Sure. So I think I will just go back to actually the beginning of this, how this project got started. I have a background both in bioethics, which is a discipline that's at the intersection of law, medicine, and ethics, and in product design, which are two things that don't normally go together. And I was attending a Global Health and Innovation Conference which is held at Yale every year. And I saw this fantastic product device that had been built by some folks at MIT or out of an MIT lab called NeoNurture, which was a neonatal incubator. And I was so excited about the design. It's really clever. This was back in 2010 that it was presented. And it was basically designed to solve a problem that folks in the healthcare context of development are familiar with, which is a lot of medical devices get sent to developing countries, and then a part breaks or there's a power outage that blows a circuit and stuff ends up in a closet somewhere not getting used. And so NeoNurture sort of turned that problem into an opportunity by designing the device from used car parts. And so with the idea that if something broke, it would be able to be fixed locally without any problem. It was designed, I think, specifically with a rural hospital in Nepal in mind. So I was really excited as a product designer about this very clever design. And then my bioethicist hat sort of came on and said, well, who makes that safe for people, or who even checks to see if that's safe? We have the FDA in the United States, but what happens in other countries? And that sort of set me off on this adventure, which has led to sort of ultimately the sort of OpenQRS, which is where we are. But it really started with this question of who makes sure that devices that are designed for people in low and middle income countries or in developing markets are safe, and what is the process for that? And so I really set out, I I worked with someone, David Karshmer, who had led the healthcare practice at IDEO in the 90s through two e-health startups at the beginning of Web 1.0. And so I was sort of steeped in the process of human-centered design and set out to really understand what was happening for healthcare and social entrepreneurs who were developing and designing these products. And that has left me, again, still with this question of how do we make sure that those devices are safe for people?
So is there an answer? Who's responsible for it, or is that the work in progress?
That's a great question. The way that we currently have our system set up is that it's really nation state based. So every country is responsible for the devices that come into their country. And what that means is that we have very established processes in the US with the FDA, in the UK, and in Europe with the CE certification. But in sort of there are sort of varying processes in some of the what might be called the middle income countries. South Africa follows. If this has been approved by the FDA or CE, then they will allow that immediately into their market. The challenge comes in that for many smaller countries or smaller economic countries, not geographic, they have very varying systems, and that kind of market unpredictability is a challenge for entrepreneurs. And so I ultimately sort of talk to a lot of entrepreneurs.
Is it a challenge for entrepreneurs because they're faced with potentially having to overcome multiple regulatory hurdles and those kinds of things? Or is the bigger question is we're not even sure who to ask?
The challenge becomes that you would have multiple hurdles that you have to go through. So I spoke with one product manager who had gone, in order to get into one market for their device, they were given a set of tests and sort of trials that they needed to do. And for the country right next door was unwilling to accept what their neighbor had done. And so then they had to do a separate set of trials that showed 1 or 2 points that were different. And so you get into that sort of variability that's motivated by other purposes than just, is this product safe?
That was a really, really nice way to say that.
And so the WHO has also some overarching guidelines, and some people will require, sort of say, well, if you meet these guidelines, but the challenge with medical devices is each device is a bit different. So to the extent that there are regulatory issues, or standards, they're often actually quite lighter than, say, pharmaceuticals, which are tested in a slightly different way, but they're still quite cumbersome. And so part of sort of my being a product designer and encountering this morass was to say, what's a solution that can transcend these problems? How could we leverage technology to basically transcend borders? We've done that with communication. Can we innovate around how we approach regulatory systems and basically transcend borders in a similar way?
Before we dive into the machinery of OpenQRS, and I think that's definitely where we want to go, is there a way that, or do you have an example of, what's the worst case scenario? Do you have an example of a device that's, gone rogue and, killed people, hurt people? Or how big is this potential problem?
Right. That's a great question. And it's actually one that I get asked quite often. Here's the challenge. Right now, what often happens is that things that do go out don't get monitored. So you might get the success stories, but you might not know if they've failed. Or to the extent that they've failed, there may be, as there often are, so many confounding factors that it may never reach the product maker that their product could have been part of the failure. And so part of my sort of interest is just, can we monitor if they're working and when they're working and how they're working as a sort of starting point. So there aren't any, and I'm very aware from a storyteller perspective that, coming out with this horrible thing happened is a great way to get people's attention, is a great way to get money opened, or budgets opened. And it's really not my interest. So sure. I'm very motivated by the opportunity to enable entrepreneurs, social healthcare, social entrepreneurs, healthcare entrepreneurs, product designers, biomedical engineers who want to build into their products something that helps them determine how to make it a better quality and safer product. Those are the people that I want to work with, and whom I want to really empower to be able to do that. And I think that a system that's based on how do we make things better will be more effective in the long run than a system that says, oh, this product failed and so we have to protect people, because the regulations that tend to come from that approach are often standardized in a way that is trying to eliminate risk for a very broad population and not necessarily meaningfully either for the local context or for the specific device.
I would think that the danger of storytelling, you say, I appreciate your approach for sure. The danger of storytelling about road devices or things that have gone wrong as well is that people might then that gets stuck in your brain essentially, and then people might design. Oh, but we want to make sure that didn't happen like it did in Nigeria, or that didn't happen like in Indonesia. And rather than thinking, hey, how can we holistically approach this and put forward thinking into it? Would you agree with that?
Yes. I mean, I think it's the challenge that I see is that when you have a very standards-driven approach that sort of says, well, these are the minimum standards, it already defines how you're approaching the problem, as opposed to saying, here's the solution that we have, how can we test that it's working safely? I think it's two different ways of saying the same thing. So what you were trying to say.
So take me to OpenQRS, because maybe it'll answer some of the other questions that are on the tip of my tongue about, one of the things that we've seen in other areas of aid and development is duplication. Or people just don't know about, hey, there's this fantastic microfinance program, or hey, there's this fantastic, birth registration system over here. And it's just the very fact that how do you know about these things in order to say, oh, well, look, I don't have to reinvent the wheel. Some people have already thought about an innovative way to do that. Is that built into QRS? Or why don't you take us into what QRS does and what the goal of that process and that system is?
Sure. So ultimately, from my sort of understanding of the problem space, I proposed the idea that if we had real-time data monitoring from devices, where the device itself, not people reporting on it, but the device itself could send back messages using sensors and mobile technology, and that we might be able to actually monitor how devices are working better than we have in some more established markets. And so the idea of OpenQRS was to basically sort of put that as a potential solution for entrepreneurs who are looking for, how can I address this? And so the first step in that, because I think the vision of OpenQRS is a much larger solution, was just to really sort of prototype, how could this work? First of all, can this work?
Yeah,
how could it work? And so we're still very much in that early stage, but we did do a series of interviews with basically just different types of products. So with a mobile health app that was a diagnostic aid, very commonly being developed, and 3D printing of medical device parts for a hospital in Haiti, someone who had an open hardware infusion pump, someone who's developing both a hardware software solution to detect rheumatic fever, so basically turning an egg cup into a stethoscope powered by a smartphone to determine whether there were heart rhythm irregularities, and then a solar-powered vaccine refrigerator. And so basically from sort of thinking about how could real-time monitoring work in any of these situations with these particular device/apps, that was sort of the next step of, how viable is this as a system, and how could this work? And I think what I've come to from that prototype work is I've identified there are at least 5 or 6, maybe even 7 different business models that could carry this adventure forward. And what I personally discovered was that none of those were business models that I personally am interested in pursuing.
You've got 7 ways forward, but you don't want to do it. So, can you give us an example of a couple?
Sure. So, for example, meeting with the product manager for a solar-powered vaccine refrigerator, this refrigerator had partners in, I think they were testing in 2 different countries in Africa, and their partners on the ground for that testing of their prototype said that they had to get WHO certification. So the WHO certification that they needed required them to put their prototype in a casing and send the prototype to somewhere for certification. And the certification was that it had to be able to maintain its temperature for 5 days without access to energy, and to show that it could sort of sustain its temperature. And I think it's a perfect example, because that one-time test could certify this prototype that it could go out in the field. And yet what we all know is that on any one of the times that refrigerator is out in the field, if it isn't able to work, it's more important to know that than to know that it was able to be okay for 5 days in a sort of ideal condition.
Yeah, sure, in a warehouse somewhere, yeah.
Right. So I think that that prompted me to sort of talk to people who were involved in IoT networks. And in Berlin, I was working with someone who was in a graduate program, and we basically sort of came up with a solution of, well, if we could build a real-time thermal sensoring system, open source, that would, let other people build on that in the future, we could basically develop a way for each refrigerator within it to be sending back little data packets over mobile Wi-Fi that would go to, for example, let's just say if it were in Kenya, maybe that the iHub in Kenya would be able to have a group that was monitoring whether monitoring these refrigerators as they were going out in real time. When the truck deliverer or the person receiving the batch received it on the other end, they could basically send a text message and say, have all of the refrigerators reported back that they were fine, and you'd be able to, just over mobile system, confirm each batch that gets delivered that every refrigerator was working fine. Or to know, well, this one, even though it lost contact for 5 hours with the data center, it stores the data reports internally, and it's able to send that data once it arrives and say, yes, we maintained our temperature. Mm-hmm. So the potential business out of that is to basically become an open source thermal consultancy, right? And so thermal monitoring is certainly a huge business. Being able to develop a system that does that for more rural environments certainly is an opportunity. The people that the U.S.-based company that organization was talking to said, oh, well, we should be able to, figure something out for you at $100 per unit, and the cost of the unit itself was $1,000, $2,000 or $2,000. So, you can see that, and that's a company that's not experienced working in Africa.
I was just going to say that pretty quickly priced themselves out of that market.
Part of, and also off the product. So, if the point is to develop a low-cost product, if the way that you assure that it's actually working to keep its temperature is that percent of the product, it's not very reasonable going forward. And of course, that would have just been for trials, not on an ongoing basis. And what I think the vision that I ultimately have is that I would love to develop this capability so that in Kenya, in Nigeria, in any country, in the Philippines, that people are learning, in schools, that these can be the data sets that people are learning their statistics on. If that data is actually made available either openly or through some sort of collaboration with universities, that you could really develop a different kind of technical capacity also within each country to basically monitor their own quality and safety.
How do you keep this work going on a day-to-day basis? It seems like give me a sense of, the market for the medical devices is potentially unlimited. So are you reaching out sort of haphazardly or randomly to threads that interest you, or are people coming to you? Is there a network that you've built this is an ongoing conversation? Like, how does this continue to move forward for you?
Well, that's a great question. I think the people that I've encountered really came out of my going out to showing up, really, in different conversations than I would normally have had. So showing up at a Health 2.0 conference in India and showing up with medical anthropologists at a conversation about point of care diagnostics. I met my first real collaborator on this project. It was Walter Carlin, who is now leading a mobile health systems laboratory at the ETH Zurich. And we met at a DCon festival. So was at the D School in Potsdam in Berlin, D School, which is affiliated with Stanford's D School. And so we met at a health panel there, and I was interested he had a pulse oximeter, and so we started talking, and I basically said, what's the next device in your pipeline, and can we start from scratch on that and see what would happen if you had essentially like an ethics consult on your device, and we could sort of work together to find out where the opportunities are for this thing that I'm envisioning and how that fits with your product development. And so that's how that got started. And then from that, I've ended up meeting people along the way.
So would you consider what you're doing now, or OpenQRS, and this conversation, when you put it on the table, like you said with your first collaborator there, or now, as you've encountered more and more opportunities, do people's eyebrows go up and they're like, oh wow, I've never actually thought of that? Or is it something that people say, we've wanted to do this forever, we've just been looking for the person to do it? Are you? I guess what I'm asking is, are you a disruptor, or is this a conversation that people have known needed to happen and you're just sort of finally bringing it to fruition?
That's a really interesting question. Depends on whom the constituency is.
Call yourself a disruptor. It's okay. No.
In this context, what's so interesting is there are so many people, right? So one of the groups that I did go out to interview several people within the community are funders, so philanthropic / impact investors. And I was surprised that there were folks in that community of people who are investing actively in medical ventures in low and middle income countries who simply said, oh, I never thought of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were others who said, yes, we know this is a problem. But we don't want to waste our money, essentially. So we'll only add that layer on when the solution is something that we know will work. And then there were others who said, we know this is a problem, and we fund our medical device ventures out, even when they're not in the U.S., to essentially go through the FDA process. So there's a spectrum on the funder side. On the entrepreneur side, there absolutely were people who said, this is a huge problem for us. Can you help us? And there were some who said, anything that's remotely kind of like a regulation thing is only going to slow us down, raise our costs, potentially reduce our funding. If it's not required, we don't need it.
And so when you fit into those conversations, do you find receptivity? So with the funders, you sort of characterize three different kinds of funders. Was it, here's how, we haven't thought of it, or yes, we've thought of it, or, we do everything with the idea. And hey, we'd love to insert that. Or do you find yourself saying, really having to struggle to get this conversation in there, on a regular basis?
Well, I think so now that I've essentially done this prototype stage, I'm really at a point where I can go back and say, here's what I've identified. These are the opportunities, and to see whether those funders would want to continue in or would want to add that layer in. And I think at this juncture, for me with the OpenQRS project, what I see as the opportunity that I want to pursue is really creating a resource for people to know what other people are doing, essentially to address something that you mentioned earlier, which is there is a lot of redundancy, or in this case, there aren't a lot of people who are either thinking about it, or some people who are, but they're definitely not aware of other people. And so essentially by trying to raise the profile of here are people who are doing great things as a springboard for others to sort of stand on the shoulders of others and build on what's been done. That's essentially where I would like to sit OpenQRS for at least the next 3 to 5 years. And I think as we gain more awareness of what people are doing, we may be able to build in some of the other sort of larger ideas that were part of the original vision and continue to be. My ultimate goal is that I want everyone everywhere to be able to feel confident in the medical devices that they use for their health and well-being. I don't understand. The question for me is, how do we do that? Because right now the system is so fragmented, and it's really a sort of 2/3 tier system. And I would love for us to live in a world where everyone who needed to use a medical device for their health could look at how it's worked for other people and make that decision for themselves.
Mm-hmm. When you're looking at the market space, so now you're going to position OpenQRS as, forgive the lack of a better term, but sort of as a hub, right? As you're gathering knowledge, you're gathering these, going to gather best practices, you're going to gather what's going on and use that as a springboard to say, how can we do better? Mm-hmm. What are the disruptions or the innovations or the things that you see happening in the next 2 or 3 years, maybe 4 years, that are going to contribute to that conversation? Are mobile networks getting better? Is the creator culture getting more and more popular globally, and so that's contributing to it? Or are there, what are the pieces that have you most excited about, that's kind of creating a critical mass for you?
Well, this also comes back to the question I think you asked just before this. In 2014, I was at the UNESCO Chair for Essential Technologies has a conference every 2 years. In fact, that's coming up at the beginning of May in Lausanne. And there I presented actually my initial work with Walter. And I also presented, in 2014, I presented my initial work with Walter, and also my proposal for this idea of OpenQRS, which is, can we do real-time open data monitoring for the quality, reliability, and safety of medical devices? And what was really interesting was I was in the opening, one of the first panels on I think it was an open science track actually, and presented the OpenQRS idea. By the end of the conference, which had multiple medical technology tracks, the kind of one of the overarching themes, and I think it crossed over maybe also from energy and a couple of other sectors, was that the regulatory system or lack thereof in the global south the absence of it was a real problem. And so there is a sort of recognition by and that was really a multi-stakeholder conference. So you had device makers, you had academics, you had policymakers, you had people who consult to governments, who were all at that conference in those conversations. And it was a very sort of shared recognition of the problem. So I was definitely excited, like, I have a solution to the problem that was identified by the end of the conference. Too bad I presented it on the first day. But, I was invited to share that that idea in a chapter in the book that came from the conference. Though I wonder sometimes who reads books on these subjects.
Does anyone read anymore? I don't think they do. But anyway, that's a different conversation.
That's a different conversation. So I do think there is a timeliness to it in a way. And I said this when I sort of recognized the sort of issue in 2010, I was very aware that nobody was ready to have this conversation. When I started to really actively work on this in 2012, I knew that it was early. I think we're still very early in this, again, mostly because I think these failures haven't started to surface. And once those failures start to surface, people will start to be more willing to engage their dollars to make this to make some other solution. My hope is that OpenQRS can be enough of a resource when that time comes that people won't do what the sort of traditional trajectory might be, which is just to say, what do they do in the US? Let's copy that. Mm. And so part of my motivation for sort of supporting OpenQRS to just be this open knowledge sharing platform at this juncture is to try to gather enough resources of what good things people are doing to basically make that not the answer, if that makes sense. But it's not, I think I don't see this knowledge sharing resource as a viable business. So that's really, it becomes my passion project that I will continue to talk about, which this whole thing really largely is my passion project, that I will continue to support personally and sort of bring people in to do that. I'm endeavoring to set that up in a way so that really other people can just be contributors and refer other people to contribute, and it can sort of grow itself.
One of the things that, as I was just listening to you describe the sort of that evolution, what struck me is that we're so often in the innovation space and in the, how to create these new tools and devices space. We are confronted with the fail fast mentality, let's get it. You even said, when you were talking about your funders about, we want to see devices work before we even think about this bioethic part, thing. Before we even consider this, we want to see the device work kind of deal. What's the lesson that you've learned, or is there a philosophy that you followed in order to have this sort of patience and persistence to keep this alive over years? Has it been small successes along the way? Has it been you can just still so clearly see that vision at the end of the tunnel, or is there some other thing? Because this is a different path to an innovation than we normally hear.
Yes, I guess we can call it patient innovation.
Hey, patient capital, right? I mean, isn't that Sequoia? Patient capital, right?
Jocelyn Novogratz, who always talks about patient capital, right? So Jacqueline Novogratz, right, who talks about patient capital. So this is patient innovation. What sustains that is really a deep commitment to the idea that everyone everywhere, I want to see a world in which everyone everywhere can feel confident in the medical devices they use for their health and well-being. And a curiosity about how can we best do that? How can we most meaningfully do that? How can we do that in a way that empowers product makers to make better products, and that empowers doctors and patients to make better decisions, and not from a place that sort of says thou shalt or shalt not, but rather one that really makes meaningful information available to people. And I think a sense that I know that we don't know how to do that, because that's not what we do anywhere in the world right now. And so that's, to me, is sort of the exciting opportunity, is how do we harness these new technologies that enable more of that information to come to people, and how can we bring that together in order to solve this problem? So back in 2000, I was left. Well, I live in San Francisco, and was part of a startup that blew up, because that's what happens with startups. And
we love that. That's part of the innovation game.
That's and the lead of the product development team was David Karshmer, who had led the healthcare practice at IDEO in the 90s. And we were the product team. So we spun out of that implosion and basically started our own venture. We took a good look at the market, which was already actually very similar to the time now, where things were sort of starting to tilt, but no one was quite sure how, because we still knew there was all this great potential in that thing called the web. So we basically came up with an opportunity to solve a pain point around adherence to medication, and we developed our solution based on human factors design and human-centered design to essentially build a social network around someone who was newly diagnosed with a chronic disease, getting them connected with peers and with a sort of mentor in something that was a little bit of a game/coaching model. And as we went out to pitch to investors, they said, "Oh, no one will ever share their information like this. There's, why would people be concerned about privacy? They won't participate in the social network like this. This game thing sounds nice, but we're not really sure if that will work." So, and then they also were concerned about we were looking at the aging population with chronic diseases. So this was a very steady internal rate of return of about 5% on the market that we were targeting, that would continue for the foreseeable future as we had baby boomers coming. And they all sort of said, "Oh, well, we're looking at it for 15 to 20x return." Of course, now in Silicon Valley, they're looking for the 40 to 60 to 100x return and all investing in unicorns. But there was really no such thing as a social impact investor. They really sort of looked at us and said, "This is nice. We know you want to do a good thing, but that's not our market." And so I think what gives me the patience is, as I sort of followed what happened with the rise of social entrepreneurship through sort of the mid-2000s, and impact investing and social entrepreneurship and social venture capital, philanthropic capital in this area, I sort of started to see, oh, there are investors for this. And then suddenly there was this thing called mobile, and everyone wanted to connect other people with other people in order to help them stay on their medications. And so by 2000 and 2010, almost the same business, literally located in the same building, by a new guy who had worked at IDEO, was looking at getting funded. And I sort of realized that sometimes ideas just take a while to really mature into the market and their readiness. So that's part of what gives me, I think, the patience. And, again, for me, it's not, I have to be the one that solves that problem. It's a problem that needs to be solved, and I want to see that done. So that may also give me a little bit more patience that I would like to see this happen. I may not be the person that does it, but I would like to see it through so that it gets realized in a way that, that sort of embodies the vision that I have, again, which is about empowering entrepreneurs to make better products, so that everyone everywhere has that sense of confidence in the devices that they use for their health and well-being. So I think those are the things that sort of, it's partially experienced. I am reminded of a Thai activist, social justice activist, whom I saw on the stage at a conference in 2007. In my sort of bioethics hat, I did a lot of mediation work, and we were at this conference called Facing Violence, Peace, Justice, and Conflict Resolution. And everyone was sort of talking about how could we have less violence in the world and more, peace. And this Thai activist got on the stage. I wish I could, I will try to find his name for you, but he sort of looked out at everyone and said, you talk about peace and conflict resolution, and you're thinking about how does this happen in 5 years and 10 years? And he was had this huge smile. And he said, think 3 lifetimes. And he sat back and laughed in his chair. And I think that also stays with me, because the impatient part of me can't understand why this isn't already happening. How can it be that
it's so obvious,
can have such different standards for people, and not that our sort of, we have lots of devices that make it through the FDA process that ultimately, once they're on the market and real people are using them in real circumstances, ultimately get pulled. So, it's not that we sort of are saying, well, we have one system that's better than other folks. It's just, so I see it as a real opportunity globally for a solution. I think that there are already so many entrenched systems in developed markets that I think this is, again, an opportunity, much like mobile, for emerging markets to really leapfrog and enable better innovation. And so I think that takes me back to a question that you asked earlier, which is sort of what are the things that I'm watching? And I think, the opportunity for emerging markets to embrace some alternative ways of establishing quality and safety will ultimately enable them to become the leaders in device innovation. So you have things, as I talked about, David Springer, who is making this egg cup combined with a smartphone to detect rheumatic heart disease. He's based at Oxford in a group that's a Center for Appropriate Technology that's led by Gary Clifford, who's a real champion of, developing quality resources for appropriate technology. And once that gets proved in those markets, that also simply becomes an affordable technology in developed markets. Navi Raju talks about Jugaad, this idea of frugal innovation. And again, these products that are developed appropriately for the context can still come to developed markets and become affordable technology. So I think that's a sort of trend to continue to watch. Again, I don't see that unfolding in a 2-year time horizon, maybe in a 10-year time horizon. I think the faster that those markets actually embrace some kind of system that enables them to show, and again, as I would advocate more rigorously with real-time data, that their devices are working, will enable them to access developed markets faster. Other areas where those kinds of technologies are getting innovated, and I think will continue, so one of the people that we worked with is Garrett Nisen, who is somewhere in Wales, who is a computer human interaction designer, and he was working on how do you make an open source hardware infusion pump a safer device. And so again, that open source hardware movement, as we see makers and other people starting to design products, hopefully it won't be out of bad story failures, but more people embracing how can we actually build better products in this context? How can we share the designs for a better product? Another person with whom we've done some work is Dara Dots, who was doing 3D printing of medical device parts. We interviewed her when she was working for a project in Haiti. I think she's now with a company that's called Field Ready, and they are delivering devices in emergency contexts, or they are basically sort of responding to the Nepal earthquake, other types of disaster situations. And so I think as we learn more about 3D printing, and again, some of the issues that I discussed with her in sort of thinking about the quality, reliability, and safety of the products she was making, we're looking at what does it mean to make something that's a design. If you design it in San Francisco, the humidity, how does that affect the 3D printer when you take it to an environment like Haiti? And that design is going to be different when you take it to an environment like the Philippines or at altitude in Nepal. So I think the more experience that starts to come from these kinds of devices will also, it forces a different conversation. And again, my hope is that it will come from people who are motivated to make better products for other people, which has been my experience, that that mindset comes from people who are in more emerging markets, or the quote unquote developing world. I'm consistently found that the entrepreneurs and product designers in India, in South Africa, in other parts of Africa are the ones who want to make devices that are safe for their people. And I've never encountered in that environment people who say things like, well, if it's not required, why should we do it? That's a very American, particularly, attitude.
I have two more questions for you. One is, you've clearly emphasized open. Obviously, it's OpenQRS. You've talked a lot about open technologies, open standards, those types of things. Juxtapose that for me with proprietary, and how does OpenQRS or this movement that you're a part of interface with all of the device manufacturers, or just the ideology of proprietary?
Basically, I think the primary motivator for me is this question of how can we make these devices safe for people? And so the answer that at least my starting point for that is, if we can make it easy and affordable to make devices safe, then that's sort of the starting point for anything that gets built on top of it. So I think there's lots of opportunity for people to have whatever their proprietary device or solution is. I would like to see the part of it that's assuring the safety and quality of it be something that is open source, or that builds on open source technology, so that other people can have access to that part. It's not the whole device design. And it is true that in order to integrate this smartly into some of those devices, it does need to be proprietary, in which case then I would sort of say, well, at the very least, would you be willing to let your data monitoring of that be open, so that there can be essentially open governance and accountability? So that may function in, we're so far away from that, but of course I've thought that through, because I'm an imaginator. So I imagine a system in which you might have that device reporting back, here's how it's doing, and here's how the device is reporting, here's how I'm doing. And that product maker may get a 6-month lead time to basically correct whatever the problem is. And maybe that only becomes public after every 6 months, so that there's some time for people to basically respond to that. But you would also know if there are device makers who essentially make something and then they never respond to the feedback, you would also know that. So it's, again, I am very aware that the vision that I have for this is ahead of kind of where the standard is for technology in the quote unquote developed world. I saw the head of Deloitte's healthcare practice was presenting at the World Health Summit last fall in Berlin. And he was essentially saying, we're starting to see this integration of real-time data monitoring into the devices. And I was like, yes, this is great. And so I recognize that that's just sort of starting, and I would like to see that be a sort of something that that piece is not proprietary, so that it can become accessible. Because I think as a sort of starting point, as a baseline in the medical device industry, isn't this what we would want for everyone? And if we can agree on that, then there's lots of proprietary technology. We can put even more smart minds together on how do we do that, and then we can unleash the potential for a lot of innovation and opportunity on top of it. I guess, in a way, I see it a little bit like Linux or Apache, but for the medical device industry. Can we work together? Can we get sort of the smart people from Siemens or SAP or some of these other companies, big device companies, Medtronic, to sort of give some of their time to help this piece move itself along in the way that large open source projects have been able to get and collaborate with industry in order to build a system that's essentially a superhighway of real-time data information that can enable devices to be better. Because I think if we have that as the infrastructure for everyone, everywhere, then there's lots of room for proprietary on top of that or around it.
Final question for you. You did a fantastic job of name dropping a few minutes ago when you were talking about some of your colleagues and some of the devices that you've seen out there. Is there any particular personality or device or movement or thing that you're paying attention to right now that you just think it's so absolutely cool, like you tell everyone about?
That's a good question. I will say one of my mentors is Andrew Lyon, who was a part of the International Futures Forum, which is based out of Scotland. And he developed this idea, or identified really this trend, which he calls the fifth wave of health and public health. And it's a beautiful piece of work. It's evolved into a book, but essentially it really sort of he sort of has put forward this idea that the first wave in the 1800s, the focus was for public health was on great public works and this kind of municipalism. The second wave, you start to see this refinement of the scientific approach, so the germ theory of disease in hospitals. The third wave being social welfare reforms, New Deal legislation, this sort of Medicare, employer-based insurance. Then we see the fourth wave as a risk theory of disease and health behaviors. And this fifth wave is really about transcending the reductionist holistic dichotomy and looking at how do we make healing interactions, sort of see the positive psychology, room for diversity as opposed to these sort of polarities. And I think that's it's a framework that inspires me and that I look for who's innovating in this way, who's sort of enabling diversity, who is it's a lens through which I sort of look at new technologies or new approaches. Is it enabling? Is it does it foster diversity, or is it sort of sticking with a different paradigm that I think we have the opportunity to transcend at this juncture in time? I think that's kind of one that's very close to my heart. Another sort of approach that's on my radar is really this sort of ecosystem approach and systems level approach to social impact issue problem solving. So Michael Myers talked about that from the Rockefeller Foundation, and they've sort of used that language in the context of how they are approaching their social entrepreneurship, social innovation funding, I think increasingly on the healthcare side. Indy Johar, who's based out of the UK, and I had a great chat about this in his experience doing work locally in Birmingham. So I think one of the other areas that's very much on my radar and something that I think, I'm not sure how it fits with the aid and development conversation, but I think we really need to start to look at is the people who are currently sort of being vulnerable and increasingly vulnerable to being forgotten are the lower class in developed countries. So we've done a remarkable job with the Millennium Development Goals to lift people out of poverty. There's a kind of growing subset of poverty in established markets. And I think that that's an area where there's a lot of opportunity. And some of this more systems level approach to understanding how to tackle entrenched social issues, both cross-sector, multi-sector partnerships, and funding that really sees solutions that are taking that lens as opposed to kind of here's the poverty solution or here's the health solution, but really having a more integrated approach. Essentially, it's a different lens. But what I was saying about Andrew's fifth wave, I think it's all still there. So,
Kate, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, thank you for this opportunity. It's been great to chat with you.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from 8preneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.